So good evening and welcome to the ZWAC Show. I'm your host, John Moore. Each month, the ZWAC Show brings a mix of the old and the new, something new and interesting in the zero waste space, plus some lessons learned from recycling pioneers that have come before us. Tonight's show, we feature an interview with someone who not only is advancing an interesting new means, literally to repurpose oneself by human composting, but who also braved the treacherous waters of the California State Legislature to facilitate this new process in California come 2027. Tonight, I will interview Katrina Spade, founder and CEO of Seattle-based Recompose, about the business of human composting and what we may see in California in 2027. In keeping with this theme of sustainable zero waste advocacy, literally after life, Recycling Archives Director Susan Kinsella has prepared a special multimedia presentation of some of the ideas of waste advocates who have already journeyed the afterworld. And although we're about a month late to celebrate Day of the Dead, tonight we will try to part the curtain just a little bit into that afterworld with Susan. So Susan, if you're ready, take it away.
Great, thanks. All right, so I need to share screen here. And where did it go? Okay. All right. And let's start. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, let's see. I have to move this over. So, given the presentation that's planned for tonight, we thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about what inspired the founding of the Recycling Archives and why we believe it's so important to grow it and keep it going. The archives actually started from some sad experiences, specifically when two of the legends in the early recycling days died much too young. Chuck Papke. One of those was Chuck Papke. Chuck graduated in the mid-1960s from Reed College in Portland, Oregon. And then he came to California and he got a job working for the city of El Cerrito, just north of Berkeley. And there he worked with volunteers to start the first El Cerrito drop-off recycling center up near an old rock quarry cut out into a hillside. Now, you might not realize today how important that was, because back then this was one of the first community recycling programs established in the whole country. That recycling center has continued operating ever since then, with only 1 year when it was closed to allow for a complete rebuild. It is still publicly owned as part of a modern recycling program. And while the El Cerrito Recycling Center has been updated over the years, that first design that Chuck Papke created was a game changer for small towns everywhere. Chuck also started a small nonprofit called the East Bay Depot for Creative Reuse. This was a small resource trading business that receives, sorts, and sells materials that teachers can use in their classrooms and artists can use for their projects, and it also has continued as a wealth of reusable materials for decades. Chuck died suddenly and unexpectedly in 1995, soon after he had just become the recycling coordinator for the state of Nevada. A big crowd of his recycling friends gathered afterwards for a storytelling wake, and I so wish we had those stories now. Pavitra Krimal is the other recycler who inspired the start of the Recycling Archives. She went to work for Garbage Reincarnation in Sonoma County and soon was running much of that recycling operation. She especially championed growing recycling through economic development, and she directed Garbage Reincarnation's reuse sales and operations for more than a decade. In particular, I remember when she gave a speech, I think at the California Resource Recovery Association conference in the early 1990s, that ended up really shaking up recycling, not only here in California, but across the country as well. She said, essentially, recycling is not the highest level of sustainability, which was a mind bender to all of us who'd been working feverishly to establish the first curbside programs and to teach purchasers how to buy recycled products. Instead, she said, we have to focus first on reducing waste and then on repairing and reusing as much as possible. Those both come before we start disassembling products and turning their materials into other new products. It was like a lightning bolt. I mean, of course we realized, but it also really shook up programs and plans as we all figured out how to integrate her message. Pavitra's speech generated whole new development areas dedicated to what at the time we called source reduction, how to prevent waste at the very beginning by not producing it at all. True to her vision, Pavitra started a company called EcoTimber in the early 1990s. This project put at-risk youth and welfare recipients to work deconstructing World War II era warehouses at the Naval Center in West Oakland that had just closed. It resulted in more than 2 million board feet of old-growth redwood and Douglas fir that then was remilled and marketed by EcoTimber. Of course, this was one of the very few places that anyone could ever get old-growth redwood lumber anymore, so it was in great demand. And in learning how to take apart buildings, those workers also learned construction skills that then they could take to get good-paying jobs later on. When Pavitra died unexpectedly in the early 2000s, everybody was shocked. Now CRA gives out the highly coveted Pavitra Krimmel Reuse Award to the most successful reuse program in the state of California each year in honor of the memory of Pavitra. Losing Chuck Papke and then Pavitra Krimmel reverberated throughout the recycling community. It exposed how important it was to not take our recycling history for granted. There were so many people who were widely recognized as important thought leaders and builders of innovative recycling enterprises who we had sort of just been taking for granted, figuring that they'd always be there, and suddenly it was obvious that that wasn't true. The stories of the early innovators are often wildly creative, full of vision, sometimes hilarious, always amazingly hardworking, and time and again even profound. But no one was collecting that history, and we were starting to lose some of those pioneers. You have to remember that in 1970, there were no curbside programs. There was no experience of collecting and finding markets for the jumble of materials that would come out of people's homes. There was some industrial recycling and some business office recycling, so there were some markets that could handle those pretty clean sources. But the recycling systems we have today, those have all been created from scratch pretty much since the late 1960s and 1970s. But back in the 60s and 70s, there were no door-to-door recycling collection services, and no one was talking about how to prioritize creating markets for the products that could be made from those collected materials. Many of the facilities and functions of today's version of the recycling system were not yet even a dream in anybody's minds. Most of the local governments, even here in California, were still scratching their heads and trying to figure out how to build a curbside program in the late 1980s. So all the recyclers at that time were working on creating community recycling programs and developing composting endeavors and coming up with policies and standards and processes to make this system reliable and solid. And mind you, this was all before the internet. So data systems were still on index cards, and communications were either in person, by telephone, or by reams of mimeographed mailings that made the rounds of recycling networks. It was as if we were constructing a huge building when these two deaths in particular made us realize that we'd been constructing it without saving the blueprints. We just figured that somebody knew where the blueprints were or could recreate them if necessary. But now we realized, what if we lose those people before we write down their stories? How can we pass on their wisdom and all the amazing things they've learned to send to the future? I mean, yes, you can change the blueprints as you learn more and go along, but it sure is helpful to know what they were to begin with. So Dan Knapp of Urban War and Neil Seldman, who was working then with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, decided they needed to do something about that. They recognized that it was necessary to create an archive of achievements and memories that could consolidate and strengthen recycling's foundation, and also disseminate the creative patterns the pioneers had been working on that could provide generative energy for others to enlarge and take further into the future. They started by inviting a group of about 20 recyclers who had pioneered some of the early projects to gather for a conference in New York's Adirondack Mountains. There they interviewed each other and produced the core interviews that founded the Recycling Archives. That was in 2007. That realization inspired the work we're doing now of collecting as many interviews as possible. We currently have upwards of more than 70 interviews and plan on hundreds more. We're also building a website to make them more widely available in the coming year, plus putting together collections of interview highlights and innovative projects that offer cutting-edge strategies. What do these recyclers who worked in such totally different circumstances have to offer today's recyclers who are coming into a field with mature programs and lightning-fast communications and possibilities and new challenges that those pioneers couldn't even imagine? I think there is so much to share. For one, their stories are creative, inspiring, and sometimes mind-boggling. They offer proven strategies and ideas and visions that focus on the future, ones that might provide clues to those going forward now. I want to tell you about some more of the early dynamic and influential recyclers whom we have already lost. I know they would have wanted to meet all the next generations coming into the field today, and I think their stories have much of value to share. May Pan and 4 of her friends were so inspired by the first Earth Day in 1970 that they decided to take action personally and open up a community-based recycling drop-off center in San Francisco that became known as Richmond Environmental Action, with service initially offered only once a month. That's where I brought my recycling when I lived in San Francisco. Over the next several years, REA expanded its service, and it also worked with Berkeley and Oakland recyclers to create a Bay Area-wide recycling association that eventually became the Northern California Recycling Association, or NCRA, which is now hosting these ZWAC programs. May and her team got the city to add a nickel a month to the authorized garbage rate. Even back then, it was termed a landfill diversion credit, with this surcharge being used to fund at least 9 more community recycling depots. They also helped stop a garbage burner in Brisbane and proposed a plan for starting 78 curbside collection routes in San Francisco, which morphed into the basis for today's curbside program there. Later, REA pitched the idea of having a city bottle bill before there was a statewide bottle bill program. They were working on the bill with Supervisor Harvey Milk, who had become a regular recycler at their site. May, a certified public accountant, had done the financials to show the city that even a local bottle bill was feasible. One afternoon in November 1978, they went over the details of the proposal with Harvey, and then he left for his office so that he could introduce it later that day at the Board of Supervisors meeting. Just before that meeting, when Harvey was starting to describe the bill to his fellow supervisor, Dan White, who had just stopped in, was when White took out a revolver and shot and killed him, and convulsed the city of San Francisco and much further beyond that. After that, Richmond Environmental Action continued until 1996, when May and her husband, Jack Barry, continued working together on environmental and financial issues until her death in 2019. Jack says, May was truly a woman for all seasons. I told her, see you in the Golden Recycle Center in the sky. And she said, I hope they don't route you to the big eternal burner. Rick Best was an amazing man who shepherded many recycling bills through the California legislature in the 1990s and early 2000s. Most of that time, he worked for Californians Against Waste. I was working there too when he first came to work with us as an intern, fresh out of college with an engineering degree. Over the next 10 years, he quickly became CAW's policy director. When Rick died, Mary Lou Van Deventer of Urban Ore wrote a story that illustrated his incredible strategic, organization, and social skills. She wrote, it was 1993 when the waste industry wrote and pushed a flow control bill in the California legislature that would have defined all discarded materials as waste. That would give the waste industry property title to everything people throw out, including all recyclables. The bill was well-financed, well-positioned, and was being lobbied hard. Despite its outrageous content, It threatened the entire recycling industry. On behalf of Californians Against Waste, Rick Best convened an unprecedented series of meetings to oppose the bill. At the first meeting, many of us who sat around CAW's table in Sacramento expressed shock at being together in the same room, much less working on the same side of an important issue. Recyclers such as NICRA and CRRA were joined by grocers, the Manufacturers Trade Association, the paper industry, anybody Rick could recruit to set aside old grudges and make common cause. As Rick laid out the agenda and chaired the discussion, a room full of sometime opponents with long histories warily explored the ways in which maybe we could protect our shared interests. He kept the focus on issues, skillfully guided us around controversies, and generally formed a disparate group of strong personalities into a cooperative team. Rick's meetings called us to Sacramento many times. Under his light-handed and skillful guidance, we developed a set of positions, formulated a lobbying strategy, conducted lobbying days, and worked together. Old opponents developed new respect and even working relationships. Our entire group debated the entire waste lobbying group in a private meeting before legislative aides. Ultimately, we lost the committee vote. The full Senate also voted against us, but the bill stopped in the Assembly because the friendly committee chair tabled the bill. Recycling was saved. We all worked hard on opposing that bill, and Rick never once seemed uncomfortable with sharing the credit. But he was the central figure who started us working, kept us organized and focused, and provided the strength and perseverance that in the end prevailed. He was our center of gravity. We thank Rick for saving recycling, and we thank him especially for doing it with a contagious spirit of cohesiveness and cooperation. So thank you, Mary Lou, for writing that. When Rick organized and guided this complex strategic gathering of unlikely collaborators and quashed the huge, well-funded waste industry, he was only 23 years old. Plus, he was in a wheelchair all his life, having been paraplegic since birth. Yet he was monumental in sparring successfully with major corporations such as Coca-Cola, Miller Brewing Company, and Dow Chemical that resulted in getting many bills signed into law that advanced recycling not only in California, but across the whole country. Through it all, he was wonderfully serene and positive, with a huge circle of friends, competing in long-distance wheelchair races, taking off on cross-country trips to follow his favorite baseball teams, serving as a board member for Sacramento's annual sidewalk chalk art event, and holding an annual waffle festival for his friends in his own home. Tragically, Rick died from injuries resulting from a traffic accident in 2002 when he was 32 years old. Gretchen Brewer started out as a volunteer at the Resource Center in Chicago, which was started by Ken Dunn, a brilliant guy focused on how to revitalize poor, rundown areas in the city. Gretchen says in her memoir, "As a social worker, I found myself thinking more about what people in this big city of Chicago could be doing in the way of more meaningful work. I was looking for work for them and for me that provided both dignity and a livelihood. At a certain point, it all clicked together. Recycling could be a good enterprise, a job creation enterprise." A friend of hers encouraged her to submit a position paper about building an economic development plan around recycling and submit it to Harold Washington, who was running for mayor. Washington embraced it and announced that, if elected, he would create a citywide recycling program that would create 7,000 local neighborhood jobs. And he got elected. And Gretchen convinced him to fund pilot programs that provided jobs for residents in some of Chicago's poorest neighborhoods. Gretchen then helped write Chicago's first waste management program that set a goal of recycling 25% and included a diversion credit to fund recycling. She also wrote a study that analyzed how Chicago was wasting a lot of money on landfill fees, incineration, and long-distance hauling that could be saved by instead diverting much of the material to recycling. This scuttled plans for a mass burn incinerator and helped further develop recycling. Then in the late 1980s, Gretchen moved on to design a plastics recycling plan for Massachusetts and Rhode Island. But plastics recycling was so new at the time that there were hardly any recycled products available. So she and her team issued the first purchase order in the US for recycled content set out recycling containers, specifying a minimum of 10 to 25% post-consumer plastic. Companies responded by developing samples, but then Gretchen and her team had to develop standards for required strength, weatherability, and other factors. So they invented what they called, as Gretchen said, a highly scientific method we called the stomp test. We turned each container upside down on the floor, and then my boss leaped into the air and jumped on it. We figured his weight approximated, probably like 1 to 2 weeks worth of recyclables, plus wear and tear. And this is how Massachusetts became the first state in North America to issue a standard for the post-consumer plastic content for recycling set-out containers. Later, Gretchen was hired by the plastics industry to provide strategic advice and educate the public and decision makers about plastics, while also beginning to build a plastics recycling infrastructure. Today, you might be thinking that plastics recycling was just the wrong direction to go in, and I think that Gretchen would be right there with you these days. She ended up getting burned by the industry and includes in her memoir a long list of dishonest techniques that she observed while she was working there, as a map for those in the future contending with the plastics industry. However, afterwards, she started her own consulting company and wrote 2 major plans and briefing books for U.S. naval bases in San Diego and Pearl Harbor on how to buy all kinds of recycled products. The San Diego Naval Station plan was awarded a White House Closing the Circle Award, as well as the top Department of Defense Environmental Security Award for their plan. Gretchen died suddenly in February 2017. When Will Box died in November of 2021, Leslie Lukacs wrote a memorial to Will on behalf of the U.S. Composting Council. She started out by saying, California compost pioneer and visionary Will Box grew up in the Netherlands and moved to California in 1979. In 1985, he launched Bennett Valley Farm Compost, processing various agricultural and fish industry discards. Will was an experienced soil scientist with a demonstrated history of organics resource recovery, creating healthy soils, carbon farming, and a leader in the industry. He has diverted over 2 million tons of organics from the landfill, creating high-quality mulches and composts, allowed for organic food production, including biodynamic compost. I myself was enthralled when I interviewed Will for the archives. He started out by telling me, I was different from the rest of my family because I loved the smell of decomposition out in farmland. My mom used to gag on the smells, but to me, it was like delicious stuff, Smells were just part of life, right? There was much that fascinated me throughout our 3-hour conversation, but especially when Will talked about developing different types of compost products to meet various needs in Sonoma County. So he explained if you have sandy soil, you need a different kind of compost from someone who has clay soil. If you're managing a vineyard with vines running vertical on a hillside, you need a compost that will prevent erosion from rain running down the hill. He told about using materials that farmers brought to his compost business, like duck manure and rice hulls, which produced a compost he called Mallard Plus. Another compost was mixed with chicken feathers to create a compost that doubled the typical nitrogen content. I especially loved the way he talked about developing compost to maximize what he called stacking functions. As he put it, how can I take this resource and enhance it to the maximum so that it actually meets the needs of the customer? And then how can I apply it in such a way that it doesn't do just one thing, such as waste diversion, but many things simultaneously? Now, when that compost goes to the soil, it conserves water, it builds soil structure, it's an integrated pest management tool, it sequesters carbon, and it reverses global warming. That is the way to do composting using a systems approach. And then he laid out a multi-step plan to take composting into the future, including ways to regenerate the soil and build it back to being even healthier than it was originally. As Will said, we must become soil and planet healers. Tanya Levy was the remarkable woman who wrote Garbage to Energy, the False Panacea, an influential booklet that was widely read by recycling advocates worried about unfair competition for recycling resources. That report armed local citizens to go up against major corporations determined to site incinerators in their towns. Tanya put it to work also when her testimony stopped the first mass burn incinerator proposed by the state for the state of California, setting the stage for many burn plant battles to come across all the country. Even before that, in her interview, Tanya said, "I saw that the recycling vision was not limited just to getting things out of landfills or picking up litter. Rather, I thought recycling's many applications provide multiple pressure points to change the way that industry looks at resources. We were looking to change the way that industry uses resources to manufacture things." She started working for Sonoma County's garbage reincarnation, run by Mike Anderson. The first waste-to-energy plant was already being planned for the state of California, and Mike and his cohorts had already been talking to the various supervisors in Sonoma County. As she describes it, Mike asked me to write up a cost-benefit analysis analyzing what participating in this thing would really mean. The project was geographically big, sprawling really, and would likely have been very costly to operate. The consultant's plan was to take garbage from several coastal counties and truck all that garbage to Healdsburg. There they would build a plant to burn all this garbage from all over to provide electricity. I concluded that the plants were simply unable to take mixed garbage that changed every day and control the air pollution and control the flow. Mike sponsored Tanya to write up and publish the Garbage to Energy book that was full of disturbing facts about burning garbage and heavily footnoted. This major treatise was read by people all over the country for a decade and became a key document in defeating the incinerator and instead turning Sonoma County to creating their recycling program. Sadly, Tanya died of a heart attack in 2011. Jay Wexler was interviewed by his son Max about his career as a lone wolf recycler, buying and selling scrap metal for a living near Philadelphia. He would hear about surplus metals that he thought could be turned into something else, or bid on lots at government auctions, or find other ways to turn junk into new uses, and he was very savvy about it. One of my favorite stories in the interview tells about when he bid on electron tubes that were being discarded by the federal government. He checked it out and found that there were copper and nickel and steel items in the tubes, but particularly intriguing was that there were rings at the end of the tubes that were identified as PT, AU, and AG. Jay had gone to Lehigh University and he'd been required to take a 2-week machine course in the summer, learning how to do welding and about milling machines and some basic metallurgy. This knowledge came in handy because he realized that those identifiers meant the rings were made of platinum, gold, and silver, and he figured that his competitors probably didn't know that. So he bid his high price of $2,100 for the lot, and then sold off each of the different kinds of metals to various companies that needed them, ending up making $100,000 on that lot. It just goes to show you how much wealth can be in the materials that get thrown away as waste. The top picture here is of Max and his brother playing in their dad's salvage yard, and the bottom picture is of jet engines that Jay was eventually able to move as well. He died in December of 2022. I can't possibly do justice with a short description of Warren Snow. He was a multi-talented and creative thinker. So I'll just tell you about one of his ventures that totally changed the recycling landscape in the United States, despite the fact that Warren lived in New Zealand. Dan Knapp was invited by the Australian government to give several talks there about his concept of total recycling. Essentially, he observed landfill discards in enough detail to break them down into 12 categories that could be recycled, resulting in no waste left over. He was particularly interested in Australian Capital Territory's goal of no waste by 2010, which it passed in 1996. He spent a great deal of time talking with a man named Jerry Gillespie, a composter who was in charge of getting the Australian government to pass the no waste goal, which succeeded. And while Dan was in Australia, he got a call from Warren Snow, who asked him to extend his stay and come visit him in New Zealand to talk more about that 12 categories concept. Warren was running the Tyndall Foundation, sponsored by the largest retail business in New Zealand. Through the foundation, he provided funding to get many material recovery enterprises up and running all over the North and South Islands. Warren was also excited about the Australian no waste efforts and asked Jerry to move to New Zealand to get similar efforts going in New Zealand. The ultimate result was that when Dan Knapp came back to the US and started telling people about how Australia and New Zealand had pushed the no waste ideas forward, the concept turned into what we now call zero waste. Both Warren and Jerry soon came to the US to speak at conferences about the concept, and Warren in particular continued making many trips to spread the discussion about zero waste, both in the US and internationally. He died of cancer in August 2022. And then finally, Mark Gorell. In 2010, Dan Knapp of Urban Ore in Berkeley, California, conducted several interviews with his close friend Mark Gorell, as Mark was dying of cancer. The interviews added up to about 12 hours and nearly 200 pages of transcription. Dan and Mark had met in their first year at the University of Oregon. Dan ended up getting a PhD in sociology, while Mark became an architect. During the nearly 50 years that followed, they became best friends, shared houses together with roommates, moved separately to Berkeley, and met their wives and brought them into their creative projects. Through it all, they collaborated on recycling design projects together that expanded the vision and the potential for actual working recycling centers that result in true zero waste. The key to what felt to them both like a magical working relationship was the mentoring that they gave each other in their separate areas of expertise. Dan's focus was on real-life experience with people's recycling needs, quirks and behaviors that would need to be accounted for in a well-designed recycling center. Mark's focus was on how to envision, plan, and draw the detailed plans that could make those insights work best in a physical environment. Putting these together, they created visionary plans time after time for different communities, different sites, different needs in different parts of the globe. For example, in several of their designs, they needed to expand a recycling transfer center that had originally been intended for big trucks to now accommodate people bringing materials in their cars and pickup trucks. Dan would work out how the design would need to accommodate the different needs of these two groups. So, for example, the large trucks were not crossing in front of people's cars, and yet the trucks had clear spaces to drop their recycling loads. Mark would then draw up architectural designs that reflected that, adapted to the land and features available. Sometimes they also designed in shops and meeting spaces and other facilities to foster community. Now at the archives, we're working on turning those concepts and drawings into a publication that can spread them much more widely. This is why I think it's so important to collect these stories. The early pioneers who figured out the first drop-off centers and the first collection routes and the first training programs to teach major purchasers how to successfully buy recycled products, and those who developed the first reuse businesses and composting business and so much more. They created these out of their imaginations and often quirky kinds of organizing plans, and they worked. And all because they had a vision of how we could treat collected discarded materials as resources rather than as waste. These stories are also pathways to the future. Not only the future that they imagined, but also the future that we are all still working towards now. So I see the purpose of these archives as looking to the past to bring out the stories, those early blueprints, and highlight trailblazers and preserve histories. And I also see the archives as looking to the future. Those trailblazers had immensely far-reaching visions that still go far beyond even where recycling development is now. Their visions and insights still provide pathways to the kind of sustainable future that we're still working on creating now. There's still immense value in those ideas and new paths going forward. I've been working in the recycling community myself for something like 40 years, but I see it as still needing a lot of development. There are still parts of the US that don't have recycling collection opportunities, and even those that are highly developed got upended a few years ago when China stopped letting us ship much of our collected materials off to them. And there are still many poor matches from our MRFs to our manufacturing plants. And buying recycled products is not yet the norm for most people in the US. Yet if we don't have collection operations that smoothly feed into manufacturing and then produce products made with recycled materials that people regard as just the normal things, then we need to do a lot more work to make it all work better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. That really reinforces how valuable it is to try to reclaim and repurpose all this knowledge that has passed before us and these ideas that people have that continue to be passed on through the archives. So thank you. And so I will segue then, going from the repurposing the mind of recyclers to repurposing the body of recyclers, as we tonight talk to Katrina Spade, who, and welcome to our show. We haven't met. So Katrina, I'm kind of in your target market. I'm almost 68. I've got to consider my disposal options in reference to the 4 R's. So I look at reduce, which applied to death doesn't really work because I can't put off death. Then I've got reuse, which I don't think we're technologically able to do at this point. There's recycle, but who's going to recycle my dead body? Rot, which kind of brings us to human composting. So tell us about human composting in Seattle. Tell us about the process.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you, Susan. That was lovely to hear about all the pioneers in recycling and composting. It's a great reminder of how many folks have kind of led up to this day and the work we're all doing. I was brought up in rural New Hampshire, and my parents were both avid recyclers and but especially avid composters. They were like obsessed with composting, and I always thought it was quite a chore as a young person. And in about 2011, I went to grad school for architecture, actually, after doing a short course in permaculture at Yes Tomorrow Design Build School in Vermont. And I was a little bit of an older student and feeling mortal like you were feeling, John. And because I'd hit 30, so I could tell, it was on my way. And I started looking at the American funeral industry and just was so uninspired by the options that were on offer. So that was sort of like the early ideation of creating something new. And then about a year later, a friend of mine told me about a practice that farmers use, and you've mentioned it yourself, Susan, just now, livestock composting. And when I heard about that, I'd been, again, thinking about my own mortality and the American funeral industry. And my friend calls me on the phone and tells me about farmers composting whole cows. And it was quite, literally like an epiphany that happened. And I thought, okay, great. Well, if you can compost a cow, you can certainly compost a human being. And that was in 2011 and 12. And since then, I've been working to make that concept a reality. I'm not sure that I answered the actual question you asked, but I wanted to give a little of the history.
I appreciate that. I guess I'm a little surprised. For some reason, I assumed that you came across this as someone who was already inside the mortuary industry, because it would sort of be a natural expansion of the services they provide. And in my legal career, I've represented mortuaries, so I was expecting that that's where you came from, but you don't, and that's pretty exciting. But I really wanted to start with talking about the process itself, as done in with your company in Washington, where it's legal.
It is legal. It's legal in 7 states and counting, including California, although it doesn't go into effect there until 2017. 27.
Right.
So Recompose uses a process that is called in-vessel composting. So we're composting humans in vessels, in a vessel system. I don't know if I can share just one image, but it may be helpful for people to see this. let's see here. This one, I think this one's helpful just because it gives you a sense of what we've created in terms of the equipment that we use. This is the Recompose human composting system. It is an array of vessels. We've stacked them vertically in part so that this can be an urban focused or urban appropriate process. And we are using as our feedstock a very consistent, carefully calibrated blend of materials. So not like food composting where it's kind of whatever you get that day. We're using a carefully calibrated mixture of primarily wood chips, alfalfa, and straw. And we lay a bed of that mixture of materials inside of the vessel, place a person's body on top of the bed of those materials, and cover the body with more of the same. So the body's really cocooned inside of the vessel, inside, and surrounded by plant materials. One of the things as a side note that we did when we were choosing the carbon and nitrogen blend, if you will, was really thinking about the olfactory experience. We mentioned the smells that come with composting, and from the beginning, design and the human experience has been at the forefront of my mind in building Recompose. And so knowing what composting inputs can be, it was really important that we chose plant materials that smelled good. It smells like wood and straw, like a fresh cut meadow. And all of that has been very carefully considered because we're talking about this really tender human experience. The body remains in the vessel for between 30 and 40 days. During that time, the vessel is aerated. We've got pretty constant airflow pulling through the vessels. We have 2 temperature probes inside of each. So our team is getting a 5-minute readout every 5 minutes, readout on temperatures inside the vessel. If you know anything about mortality composting on farms, you know that temperatures get quite hot. In mortality composting, typically what happens for us is we place a body into a vessel. It's been cooled. Typically, it's been stored and cooled as storage. The plant material is usually ambient temperature. So everything's around 50, 60 degrees Fahrenheit. On the second day, the body has been in the vessel. The temperature readout is about 150 degrees Fahrenheit. That happens extremely quickly because we've, again, really tailored the plant material and the mixture so that the microbial activity can happen right away and with full force, if you will. We see those temperatures hover above 131 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the magic composting number for composting mortalities. It has to be for 3 days by regulation, but it stays above that threshold for typically for us between 1.5 to 3 weeks time. And not constantly though, for a few days at a time, we see those temperatures high. Just to sort of finish up on the process in the vessel, when those temps start to fall below 131, our team presses a button on the iPad and the vessel rotates slowly. And that, as anyone who's composted knows, mixing material is important. That mixes everything up. It lets air permeate throughout, and those temps rise again. It's really this beautiful graph of rising temps from microbial activity, and then they start to fall. The rotation happens, they rise again. And we see that graph do this, about between 5 and 7 times over the 30 to 40 days. At the end of 30 to 40 days, our team removes the soil. It looks at that point like a fine mulch. They're also removing the bone because the bone isn't breaking down in that short of a time frame. And they're removing any non-organics like a titanium hip or other metals or plastics. All of that gets screened and sorted by hand by our team. And bone is reduced mechanically at that time into like a fine sand-like substance. The non-organics are recycled. So there's actually recyclers out there that have worked with crematories for years, and we use the same recyclers. And then the reduced bone gets reincorporated with that compost Everything is mixed well and cures for another few weeks. At that point, it's been about, between really, usually it's about 7 to 12 weeks time total. And families can come to Recompose and pick up that compost, or we donate it to conservation partners that we have.
So what can a family do with the compost after they get it back?
So the compost is by law treated like ashes from cremation. And it's interesting because we're creating about a cubic yard per person. Ashes from cremation, it's about, like a half gallon. And the regulators, as the person who was sort of spearheading the work with legally and with the regulators, I think that treating the compost like ashes is pretty okay. In most states, you can scatter ashes as long as you have permission from the landowner. So in Washington State, that's the case. That's a pretty decent regulation, in my opinion. So really, that means that families can do just about anything with it as long as they have permission from the landowner. I have some great stories. Probably my favorite story is, and I know I can use their names because they've given me permission, but a person named Wayne, who was a Seattle resident. And by the way, our facility is in Seattle, if I haven't mentioned it yet. Our person named Wayne died, and his body was composted by us. And his sister, Marie, came to pick up the soil at Recompose, the compost. And she brought a trailer because it's a cubic yard. So it really does require a pickup truck or a trailer. And my staff met her. They forklift that compost into the trailer. They, tarp it up really nicely, tie it with a bow. And Marie drove back to where Wayne had lived in Seattle in his neighborhood. He was an avid gardener. He lived in this one neighborhood most of his life. And all of Wayne's neighbors met Marie at his former home. They all came with 5-gallon buckets. They got some of Wayne's compost. And I like that, number one, his neighbors are still gardening with him. And number two, the idea of kind of being folded back into the city that you've lived in and being part of the natural landscape in the city has always been sort of the vision of Recompose.
So in Washington, if I were composted, my family could put me in the backyard and plant an apple tree.
Yep, just about. I mean, people have done trees, a couple. I know some that have planted some. I think it was peach trees, rose gardens, and often folks like to share the compost out with a number of friends.
Or if you had a kind of a poor personality, you could make yourself into poison oak or blackberry bush, I guess.
Yeah.
Is there any safety issue with eating the apples?
Not the apples. That's actually an interesting question that you bring up, because when I started thinking about this, I was all about like the full circle, and I was like, we can grow food, and then you die, and then you're part of the food system, and then I pretty quickly realized that, like, I was doing some initial radio interviews and stuff, and I realized that was so distracting to the whole idea. Like, people would grasp this idea, like, oh, grandma's going to become tomatoes, and they would just get, understandably, I guess, they would just get all weird about it. And so I pretty much, I early on kind of dropped that as a message. From a biological sort of safety standpoint, it's pretty unlikely you're going to get sick even if you ate this compost. I would not recommend eating the compost, though. I mean, like, why would you do that? So we do, our party line is like, don't grow food. Just use it on trees and ornamentals. There's lots of things you can grow that you don't eat. And then we do say very clearly, like, we really don't use it on tender annuals, because you could, if you don't wash them carefully, there's a chance that you could ingest something. Now, that said, this compost is tested, meets regulations that actually were created by the Department of Ecology around livestock. So it's very safe, but I still wouldn't eat it. I also just think it's kind of gross to eat compost, any kind of compost.
Well, I wondered because another thing that I've done in my legal career is help, waste treatment plant, with their tertiary treatment and using it for irrigation water, although not potable water. And the safety issues and sort of the queasiness factor comes in there too. So I just wondered if there's a real safety issue with eating the apples, if I was inclined to want to eat my grandmother's apples.
Definitely not apples, because any pathogens that happen to be remaining in that compost aren't going to make it up the tree into the apples. It's really if there were, we test for salmonella and then E. coli. So, and we can't send the compost back unless we fall below those the right levels. But that said, it's not sterile. It's living, very, yeah.
But while we've got this picture still on the screen, this looks like in the picture a pretty big wall. What's the actual dimension look like?
Yeah, so this is each one of these vessels is about 4 feet in diameter.
So maybe
so that didn't answer your question. I'm not sure how long it is. It's like
50 feet, 100 feet?
Something like that. More like 40 or 50 feet.
And how high?
About 15 or 20.
Okay. What do the plants serve any? The plants that are in the picture have any purpose, or they're just decorative?
They're just decorative.
It looks very, very space agey. It almost looks like an internment wall in a cemetery for people who have been cremated, except it's sort of a space agey pod look. What's the cost of building and building and maintaining this kind of a facility?
Let me see here if I got another picture to show you. So we used I'll go to this one. This is whoopsie doops. There we go. Recompose Seattle is in the industrial district in Seattle. We leased and rehabbed an existing warehouse building. Then we had a muralist put this beautiful mural on the wall and grew a big garden outside. Not vegetables though. It is a capital intensive project. We're a fully licensed funeral home. We're a fully licensed NOR facility. I hadn't mentioned this yet, but human composting's formal term and legal term is natural organic reduction, or NOR. So then there was we're also regulated as a compost facility by the Puget Sound Clean Air Agency. So the system itself is fairly highly regulated from a number of different agencies, both because we're dealing with human bodies and because we are composting. And so it is I'd say it is a fairly capital intensive process. I wouldn't recommend an individual. It's really people get in touch sometimes, say, could I just create one vessel and just compost people? And it would be tough to do so considering all of the regulations that go with.
That seems like a high barrier to entry to market, to have that regulatory system and a high capital cost.
Yeah, I mean, it is.
When you came into the business, was it already legal in Washington, or were you part of the legalization effort?
No, I was the first person that was stupid enough to, just kidding, I won't say that. I know lots of folks that have thought of this before. I've talked to farmers, for example, who've said, oh yeah, I've always thought that'd be a great idea. I was the first person that tried to get it to happen. In 2015, I did a proof of concept with a university in Western Carolina to start to prove that it was possible to compost a human being, although, of course it is if you can compost livestock. We then did a pilot study with Washington State University Soil Science Department in 2018, this time to really prove that the process was safe for the environment and for people. Again, knowing it was from livestock composting, but figuring we couldn't go to the legislature without proving safety for humans. So we did a pilot program with 6 donor people, people who, some of whom I met before they died, and they donated their bodies to this study. That study proved that indeed, like livestock mortality composting, the resultant compost was safe for use on plants. And we took those results to the Washington State Legislature in 2019. And in the first session, the bill passed. I'm going to just go ahead and show you this photo because we are smiling so very hard. I think some of us couldn't believe it passed in the first session. And since then, we've Recompose, and I have been involved in Colorado, California, and then 4 additional states: Oregon, Vermont, New York, and Nevada, in making sure that the laws get passed, but as importantly, that the regulations do allow operation without too much difficulty.
So does Recompose operate facilities in all those states or just Washington?
So far, just Washington. It's my dream to have facilities all over the place. One of the ways we're trying to do that is through our licensing program, actually licensing the equipment that it's taken us years to design and the know-how and the process. But it still takes a great deal of capital to get up a facility. So it doesn't really take down that barrier of entry.
So if this isn't coming to California until 2027, and something should happen to me before then, what do I do? Does somebody have to get my remains to you in Washington?
I believe when I last asked our staff that 18% of our clients are coming to us from California right now.
Oh,
So yeah, it's pretty something we do with some frequency is accept bodies. They fly to us typically, though some drive. We collect them at SeaTac and start the process that way. As you might imagine, it's not great for the carbon footprint, though my math shows that flying from California won't totally negate the carbon benefit of being composted, but it will take a chip out of it.
So I have to have somebody ship me to Washington, then you will compost me, and the cubic yard of soil will be shipped back to California then?
Well, so that's up to you because Recompose also has relationships with land partners up here. We have 3 at this time. They're conservation organizations that own land, and clients can donate the compost to those organizations. So if you didn't want all of it, we could send you a little box. This is our little box right here. There you go. And have the rest donated. And about half of our clients choose to do that.
So the compost that the families don't want, where does it end up?
Well, it's at one of 3 land partners.
Yeah. And they use it to land applied for a variety of crops or?
Yeah, well, not crops, but for restoration projects. Like often it's either distribution on meadowlands. Like, for example, one of our land partners has 700 acres that they're stewarding back to health. They were mismanaged in terms of the logging practices in the 1930s. And when I met this land partner, they were like, we need biomass and nutrients because all of it has been degraded. And I thought, that is something that we can offer, biomass and nutrients. That's what is in compost. And so when clients donate the soil to that land partner, some of it gets distributed on the meadows, and some of it's actually used for seedlings for new pioneer species, and some of it is used, again, for general distribution. What we don't do at Recompose is track each person's compost to a particular tree, because our kind of motto is it's about the forest, not about one particular tree.
Right. So when this comes to California in 2027, I had an image in my mind that this would be, a big deal for the local mortuaries. They would expand their services. But it sounds like the capital cost is prohibitive. So how is this actually going to happen in California in 2027?
So it's interesting. If you look at the crematory model, it's potentially a little bit similar. I'm definitely biased and think composting is far superior to cremation. But in terms of the model, often funeral homes will work with crematories that are doing the work of cremating bodies, and every single funeral home doesn't have a crematory.
Right.
So really, one model Recompose also is working under is that like a funeral home can send Recompose a body. It doesn't have to start up its own facility.
Right. So you could maintain your facility in Washington and be the and partner with the California mortuaries, just like if something happened to me today, my family would ship me to Seattle anyway.
Exactly. And I'm glad to hear that you're coming up to Seattle if something happens to you.
Well, yeah, or they're just going to bury me in the backyard, one or the other. But you could be buried. You could be buried with somebody else's compost too, couldn't you?
In fact, yes. In fact, we've had a number. It's perfectly legal for us to put ashes from a cremation into the compost system. So we've done that sometimes too. Folks have actually asked for their pets or their human loved ones, to be put in with their composting process.
It's kind of romantic in a way, isn't it? Be together forever. I have a cat that's ready for that. Her ashes. We don't normally like to talk about burning on this show either, but we're making an exception.
Actually, you'll all appreciate this. I think I had, so the one, in general, people mostly are either extremely enthusiastic about this idea or they don't care because they're like, I don't want it, so do whatever you want. But the Catholic Church has been formally opposed to the idea of composting humans. And I will say it's been pretty light touch opposition. They send in a letter typically saying we're opposed, but there's not like anything to follow that effort. And we've composted a number of Catholics and even had priests who've blessed the compost or the person's body beforehand or both. But what I found so interesting was there was an article where the journalist, I think, was quoting a Catholic priest or something who was against it, or some sort of higher up, and said, composting, that's like how you treat waste. And I thought, what else do you do with waste? You burn it or you bury it. It's like, it was such a funny argument because, first of all, I don't think of the human body as waste. But secondly, if that's your argument, what do you think cremation and burial is? And finally, of course, you should be recycling it, which is what composting is.
It's surprising that a lot of people in California think everything is waste if they're making money from that.
Interesting. Seeing what else, other shots I've got for you. That's a nice close-up. That's sort of the quality of the compost. You can see it's kind of mulchy.
So what's the Catholic Church's objection to this in a nutshell, even if it's done lightly?
The Catholic Church didn't approve cremation until the 1980s. So I think it's a matter of being very slow to accept anything.
Wait a minute, didn't they burn people at the stake? I mean, okay.
John, that was only sinners.
Is there a dogmatic reason behind it, or is it just, you don't know?
I don't know.
Is there anything that would prevent a Catholic from getting into heaven if they don't bring their body intact?
No, I don't think so. Cremation, if you're a Catholic, you are supposed to bury the ashes in a consecrated ground, but you could certainly do that with this compost if you wanted to. So,
well, maybe they've come around. They change occasionally.
Yeah.
Years. So, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought here for a second. So, what you're also a hero, and because you come down to California and you got our to do something. How did you do that? I
didn't hear the first part, but I think you said something about changing California law was the essence.
Right, you came down to California and you got our legislature to change the law. So how did you do that?
Well, actually, it took us 3 years in California. The first 2 years, we had a very enthusiastic assembly member in Southern California who wanted to run the bill, and we thought, great. And she worked hard at making it happen, and it kept dying in some committee or another. And the third year, we did hire a lobbying team to help us just push it through. I mean, it wasn't even that it was opposed. It was just, as you probably know, it just got kind of stalled out. So I've learned that that is what lobbyists do, is just move things. And it's not about really opposition. It's about, I guess, competition with other bills.
Did you have to make substantive changes that were not what you wanted along the way, or to get it passed?
We didn't. We had sort of since I wasn't coming from the funeral industry, there was at first a little bit of, I think, distrust by the funeral industry as like, who is this? What is this idea? This is weird. But the funeral industry as a whole wasn't opposed, actually, very much. Sometimes we'd have to like explain what it is we were bringing up. I think it's because they saw that they know clients are asking, the industry is changing, and they saw it as a business opportunity, which makes a lot of sense. But we didn't have to make a ton of changes that we didn't like. I'm interested to see if in 2027 we can operate, though, because I have a feeling that it's technically then, but I don't know that the regulators are going to be all done by then. So,
Are the regulators starting now, or are they going to wait till 2027 to convene?
I don't know. That's a great question. I can tell you for sure it doesn't take 4 years to write up these regs. It's not that complicated.
Have you written them for them?
I mean, pretty much. Washington's are pretty good.
So your navigation of the California legislative process was really just lubricating the wheels so that they moved.
Pretty much.
There was no blocks under the wheels. You just had to lubricate them.
Yep.
It's pretty interesting.
John, are you going to open it up for others to ask questions?
I
There's a lot
am.
of questions in the chat.
I am momentarily. I'm going to
Okay, thank you.
take this off the screen, though, for the moment. In fact, that's probably as good a time as any to start, because I do see that there's a lot of questions. Why don't I just start reading the questions?
Okay.
I think
Going,
Mary Lou had the first one.
going back to the safety issue, what about someone who has been undergoing chemotherapy? How to determine the toxicity of their compost? Is that an
Great
issue?
question. So there's a couple of reasons you wouldn't be a candidate for human composting. One, you've died of Ebola. I think that was, anyway, one, you've died of Ebola. Two, you've died with active tuberculosis. Three, prion disease like Creutzfeldt-Jakob. I never say that right. Apologies. Those are three diseases that aren't shown to be broken down by composting.
How do you know?
How do I know that? Well, the livestock composting has been happening for several decades, and it's been really well researched. And the reason is that it's been used by departments of ecology, departments of transportation for roadkill, and all sorts of agricultural institutions. And so there's tons of research around it. And so a lot of the research comes from that livestock composting.
Does that get translated into regulations, like you can't compost someone with active TB?
Yes. I'm not sure, to be totally honest, the active TB came from the Board of Health here, and I don't remember exactly if that was directly from livestock or not. And Ebola is not a farmyard disease either. The other thing is that if you have a physical radiation implant, so like radiation seed implant, that has to be removed from the body, and the body has to sit for 30 days before it can be composted. You can't put an active radiation implant into the composting vessel. But in terms of pharmaceuticals, including chemotherapy drugs, one of the things we did with the pilot project at Washington State University was we tested the pharmaceuticals in the people's bodies as like after they die or as they died, and saw a 95% reduction in pharmaceuticals, which was actually, well, first of all, not surprising from livestock research, but second of all, kind of a bonus, because the reality with pharmaceuticals is they're in our waterways because of toilet use. So the funeral industry isn't, even if composting didn't break down pharmaceuticals, the funeral industry, funeral care wouldn't be the bulk of the problem with pharmaceuticals. It's wastewater.
Mhm.
But again, we found a 95% reduction during this study. So the other question is often about heavy metals and what about the mercury in our teeth and all of that. And what we did there was simply test the resultant compost for heavy metals. And we continue to see everything far under the EPA's limits for heavy metals. And I think that may have something to do with the bulk of feedstock, the plant material ratio to something like a filling. But also we're screening and sorting for teeth. So we're actually not, that often gets screened out during the process.
So it sounds like you don't do these things because you're regulated to do them. You do them because you have your own concerns and you to deal with these things.
I'm a pretty big fan of the regulations as they stand, and I think that they're reasonable in terms of operating up here in Washington. I can't speak for California yet because they haven't been written, but I wouldn't want to create a process or invent this sort of little sub-industry and have it go on to do harm to the environment when the entire reason for it is to do good.
So if it comes to California, it's going to be the local funeral home that does the screening in the first instance about what the body might contain that needs to
Exactly.
be addressed. Okay.
And that's often the medical examiner for certain diseases is letting the funeral home know.
Mhm.
Actually, in California, in El Cerrito, Sunset View Cemetery will ship people to this facility in Seattle because I've asked.
Well, great.
So I assume that they will do the screening if you have screening criteria that you send them. Yeah.
So going through the chat, we have composters here, and somebody are turning process manual or motorized, and how often do they turn?
We have a motorized turning process. We rotate about once at the first 7 to 10 days. Usually that's the first rotation. We rotate for about 45 minutes and it's quite slow, the rotation. Again, that was partly going, you know what? I don't think we want to imagine a kind of sneaker in the dryer situation with human bodies. And it was partly that we found that actually it mixes really well to go fairly slowly.
Grandma spinning in her grave turns into reality. Is that right?
Exactly. And then we rotate about once a week for 4 to 5 weeks.
The question, is there any desire to create different methods in OR that not phthalic, perhaps using fungi or worm composting methods? It seems like that would be difficult with the health standards, but maybe someday, and it would have a lower carbon footprint possibly. So it's kind of a combined question statement. Are you looking at different methods of NOR?
Recompose is not right now. We feel pretty good about our process, the kind of balance of the carbon footprint, because we do use electricity for our fan system and rotation, but also knowing that we're making, like, as an alternative to cremation and conventional burial, it's making still definitely on the kind of positive benefit side. But I think it's exciting to see new operators and providers coming up with new ways of doing it. It's just fun. I mean, it's not always fun, but it's pretty cool to see people grabbing the idea and running with it.
Yeah, and I get to ask these interesting questions like, for example, the question, have you researched composting with soldier fly larvae?
No, but I did know once a person who was doing something like that in San Francisco. But I don't think it was human cadaver based.
How about the idea of using liquid nitrogen to freeze dry human bodies at some point in the process?
I think there's a company in Sweden. Is it Sweden that's doing something like that? Gosh, I wish I could remember the name so you could look it up. And then there's a process called alkaline hydrolysis, which is legal in a handful of states in the US and is about a high alkaline solution that essentially like melts the body down to create I think sterile, no, must not be sterile because they're using it on plants, but that creates a liquid and they call that water cremation. So there's interesting other ideas percolating.
Have any competitors so far in the States?
Will you say that one more time?
Do you have any competitors so far in the United States?
Yes, we have 2 in the Seattle area and 1 in Denver, Colorado.
So Seattle's the hotbed of human composting along with Grange Rock and bookstores.
Literally a hotbed.
Yeah, literally.
Good one.
So one of our composters wants to know, what's the carbon to nitrogen ratio of your finished product?
Ooh, gosh. I don't know off the top of my head. Our finished product is, according to my dear friend, Dr. Lynn Carpenter Boggs, who's sort of stewarded me through all things livestock, or excuse me, mortality composting. It's pretty standard. Funny story. When we started this, I was like, it's going to be the most spectacular compost that anyone's ever seen because it's human. So clearly it's going to be incredible. Well, she said, no, it's going to be good compost, but we're doing it pretty quickly. I can send you that after because I've got those numbers just now off the top of my head, but it's a pretty standard, pretty good result in material.
So Recompose is a business, and I'm wondering, how many people do you employ, and what kind of jobs are there?
It's pretty cool. We have 15 people on staff, and about 10 work at the facility in Seattle, and the other 5 are helping to keep growing this and do sort of back end work. The 2 types of people who work at the facility are our front of house services staff, and some of those folks are licensed funeral directors because we're a licensed funeral home. And they work with clients. If someone's about to die or has died, you call us and they work with you through the whole process. And then on the other side, we have our NOR operators. And those folks are tending to the vessels, tending to the composting process. And they have a much more broad background. A couple of them were crematory operators, so we're familiar with handling bodies and working in this type of space. One of them worked at a nursery, plant nursery. Another one was a zookeeper. So it was said when she came on, said, I'm familiar with, yucky things and big mammals. And so it's that group is kind of varied in their backgrounds.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have questions for Katrina? I've gone through the chat.
Jennifer had a good question about, which state department is handling the promulgating the regulation?
In California?
Yeah.
We haven't gotten super involved, but I believe is it the board or the Department of Health and the funeral board? And I'm trying to remember which department that comes under, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But in many states, it's the Board of Health, and then whoever's got the funeral board in Washington, that's the Department of Licensing.
Peter, if you find the bill that passed, it says right in the bill which department's supposed to do the regs, and I don't remember either. It
would be funny if it was CalRecycle, as Jennifer said, but
it wasn't them, but it was some department I'd never heard of.
And
And
then my other question is, how many people have gone through the process for Recompose so far?
Thank you. We're at 350. We also have a program called Precompose. We have
I'm gonna,
1,500 members as Precompose members. My sister-in-law came up with that name. And that's a prepaid funeral arrangement with Recompose, and it's a trust. So that means rather than use an insurance product, which I just feel are like a little, well, doesn't really matter. We have a more straightforward funeral trust. So you put money in and it stays there till the day that you die. And so those folks are 20, 30, 40, all the way up to 90.
yeah, normally I'm an early adopter and I want to do it first, but in this case, I'm happy to wait and be one of the last ones to use it.
Well, you could get a Precompose membership and then just not worry about it for a nice long time.
I have it already.
Oh, nice. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
so with the 350 or so bodies that have been processed, how many can you do at one time? How many cells do you have that can be working at the same time?
We have 34 operational vessels.
Are they pretty much working all 24/7 all the time?
We're not full right now, so we're always thinking, okay, how full would we need to be on a month-by-month basis before we wanted to install more vessels? We have space for 20 more in our facility, and right now we have enough kind of leeway that we're not feeling like we need to install more.
How did the bodies get put into the machine?
So our staff does that. It takes about 3 people, actually. We have designed what we call a cradle, and the body lays on that, and then we insert the cradle and with the body on it, pull the cradle out without the body on it. So I will say that a lot of the design time years ago went into how do we do this in a way that feels like respectful and gentle, because there are livestock composters on the market, but they're not thinking about that for the most part. So we really wanted to design a process that was human appropriate.
What kind of,
And that's really great that you are sensitive to those issues as well as to being a good place to work.
Thank you.
I'm Portia, the executive director of NICRA, by the way.
Hello.
what kind of maintenance issues are there with these machines?
Well, over the years we opened, by the way, with our operating in December 2020. So, I mean, over the years we've had various maintenance issues, but nothing, I'm trying to think of, I recall one time one of the air hoses got disengaged and we had an anaerobic situation on our hands, which wasn't awesome, but the reality is that composting is very forgiving. And so we at Recompose, we try to remember that there's not an emergency in what we're doing, and we're really following nature's process. There's not a timeline or a deadline either. So we work with our families to make sure they know how long it may take, but everybody has turned out to be different. And similarly, like when we have an issue like this compost goes anaerobic, which I think again only happened once, but it's pretty easy to restart a composting process through mixing, through additional feedstock, or as you probably have had an issue before, if you've composted and you're like, this thing isn't doing so great, you can usually get it going again.
Are there things that you put in with the body to identify it later after it's gone through the compost, like a label or something? Because you hear about that at the mortuaries that got overwhelmed, like during the pandemic, and then they lost track of which body was who. And
Who's who?
Yeah, no, we have part of the reason the funeral board is involved in regulations is that side of things. So there's a really strict chain of custody protocol. It actually does involve a metal tag, just like goes through cremations with you. And so our team is also scanning the body at each various station, and when it arrives at the building, it gets its little metal tag, it has a barcode, it's getting scanned and then going through the process, and then the soil is additionally kept separate until, if a family says they want to donate it to conservation land, that's when the chain of custody ends and we do commingle the soil.
There's a concept with some materials management where you have like a watershed or a waste shed identified, like for a certain region. You could say in this region there's this much generation of this type of material, and so we need X number of facilities to handle that much material. I'm wondering if you've done any kind of analysis like that. Of course, it depends on how many of your units are in a building.
That's a
and how
good
much
idea.
population, but
No, I like that. We haven't done quite the like waste shed analysis, but I like that idea.
I mean, like for California, are you kind of thinking to have one in Northern California and one in Southern California?
Yeah, I mean, my dream is this becomes so mainstream. Right now, more than 50% of Americans are choosing to be cremated. And so I like to imagine what it would be like if the people who are just choosing that kind of as default were choosing to be composted. That's the dream.
Yeah, Mary asked if there was a location in California that you were thinking about.
I wish I could say yes, but not quite yet.
Thanks.
How
I was
much-
just gonna jump in and see if it had been determined yet. So sounds like it hasn't been decided on yet.
Not yet.
Okay. Thanks, Katrina.
Yeah, it's nice to see you.
Good to see you.
What would be the current fee?
The
If I
current-
arrive, yeah, an asteroid hits me tomorrow, and I presume you're not very happy to have bodies with all the stuff they put in them for funerals. So, it has to happen fairly quickly. So I get shipped with dry ice up to you in Seattle. What would be your fee for doing this?
First of all, I'm stuck on the asteroid because I feel like if you got hit by an asteroid, there just wouldn't be anything left to compost. Our Recompose has a price of $7,000 that includes transportation from the Seattle region, and that includes SeaTac. It includes storage in our cooled storage. Like if, for example, your family wanted to even come up to Seattle, we have some beautiful event spaces in our building. So if they wanted to come up to Seattle, we could store your body for up to several weeks easily, as long as it's in cooled storage.
Wow.
The price also includes the composting and then donation or receipt back for the family. Just to give you some context, you can find a cremation that's going to be less expensive than that. Cremations, usually you can find, depending on the area, for about $1,000 if you don't get any bells or whistles with it. Burial starts, depending on what type you're getting, it starts, if it's conventional burial, probably around $15,000, and a green burial is around $7,000 to $8,000. So we tried to price it somewhere in the middle, but also, pay our staff well and all that good stuff.
Well, you got to make a living, but 7,000 is actually in today's market, which in fact I have explored. 7,000 is not a bad deal at all. That's pretty good.
And shipping up to Seattle, do you have any idea what that would cost?
Ooh, I think from the Bay Area, gosh, I want to say 1,800, but don't quote me on that. And it depends. The way it works is you work with a local funeral home, and they take care of the transportation, and then we pick up at the airport.
All right,
And we
so
have
can't
a
just
good
put
one.
it in the back seat. You can't just put it in the back seat and drive up with some dry ice.
Actually, you can drive to us. So if you have a DIY family or friends, what I would recommend is you call Recompose, because our funeral directors will talk to your friends and family about how to do it. Make sure you have the right paperwork. We've actually had a couple of people drive up, and we encourage it because there's so much that, especially for people who like to do stuff DIY, we encourage it and we'll help make it happen wherever we can.
One last
Personal
road trip.
touch. Yeah.
Final road trip.
Any other questions for Katrina before we wrap up? So thank you so much for coming tonight, Katrina. You know, we try to feature recycling pioneers in the show, and you're sort of a living pioneer as far as I'm concerned. You've created a brand new zero waste industry. So congratulations. Thanks for coming. The ZWAC show is the second Tuesday of every month, and we'll see you next month.
Thank
After
you
the
so
years.
much. It was nice to talk with all of you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.